Until recently, one of the least explored regions of the world was northeasterly Saudi Arabia, a parched desert across which hardy Bedouins drove their flocks in a never-ending quest for forage and water. In this vast desert without rivers, streams, or even springs, the few hand-dug wells were far apart. One fitful source of water was a cistern fed by drainage from occasional winter rains. It was built more than 1,000 years ago on a caravan route from Baghdad to Mecca. Since those days, the customs and clothing of these wandering Bedouins had changed hardly at all. They eked out a meager existence in a lost world, a world that had stood still since before the dawn of Western civilization. Their plane landed at Aramco's headquarters, the town of Dhahran. Thus began their adventure. In July 1947, with a temperature around 120 degrees, a little group of Arabs and Americans set up tents in the burning sand some 150 miles northwest of Dhahran. Their task was to establish the main receiving port and supply depot for the whole Saudi Arabian portion of the Tapline system. Arab laborers and craftsmen were integrated into the project. Some had already learned trades with Aramco. Others were trained on the spot. Tapline policy from the very beginning was to employ as many Arabs as possible. Local clay fortified by cement was turned into bricks. These bricks were used by Arab masons for the construction of some of the permanent buildings. As more and more material arrived, construction at Ras El Mishab went on at a faster pace. Concrete foundations were laid for Quonset buildings to be used as shops and warehouses. Tanks were erected for the storage of water as well as fuel. As the work of construction went on, there was one conspicuous difficulty: language. At first, a few of the Arabs spoke a little English, but hardly any of the Americans knew a word of Arabic. However, patience and good humor on both sides soon brought understanding. The Americans adjusted themselves to Arabian customs, too. 5 times a day, the Arab workers, all of them devout Muslims, turned toward the holy city of Mecca and said their prayers. In addition, it had its own airfield where large transport planes arrived and departed daily with mail, freight, and passengers. Each flight from Dhahran brought more skilled craftsmen from America to swell the ranks of the pipeline builders. The recruits were taken in hand by personnel officers who drove them from the airfield a mile into camp. The pipe was moved 15 miles in gondola cars to a pier at Long Beach. With 3 machines running in tandem and taking about 20 minutes for a round trip, the skyhook could deliver more than 1,000 tons a day from the sea island to the pipe yard. The first was to be a 315-mile gathering line, owned and operated by Aramco, connecting present or potential oil fields up to a point known as Kesuma, where the oil would be metered. The second division would take off from Kesuma for its 753-mile run to the Mediterranean, and that would be Tapline proper, an uninterrupted artery. By February 1948, clearing and leveling of the right-of-way began in the direction of Adcake from a point some 40 miles northward. Behind the ripper came Arabs with wagon drills, sinking holes for dynamite where the rock couldn't be displaced otherwise. The powder monkey's job was one the Arabs took to very readily, for, like people everywhere, they enjoyed setting off firecrackers. They were well instructed in safety precautions, however, and when the charge was set, everybody was well behind the firing line. Among the phenomena of Saudi Arabia is the dreaded shamal, a violent northwest wind that sweeps across the open plains and over the dunes, whipping up curtains of dust and sand. Sometimes lasting days on end, its blinding fury immobilizes almost every living thing on the desert. Everything, that is, but the pipeliner. As the above-ground portions of the line were erected, they became barriers to Bedouins with livestock, so ramps were thrown up at frequent intervals for the convenience of these desert travelers. There were no expansion joints, and the pipe was held stationary by ring girders in its above-ground portions, which were to make up about 40% of the whole tap line system. Then the ring girders were bolted together to hold it firm. In areas where the pipe was to be buried, the procedure was more conventional. The floor of the ditch had to be smoothed out and padded. Many of the Arabs doing this work were desert tribesmen, to whom a construction tool, even as simple as a hand shovel, was a novelty. More than 1,200 miles of mainline highway and access roads were built. It was a big job just to keep in repair the low-pressure tires used on all the trucks, trailers, and graders. There were the giant 50-ton truck tractors for hauling pipe, and hundreds of other vehicles of various types, besides all the earth-moving machinery. 52 wells were drilled at strategic locations, and 40 of them brought in water. Most of it was brackish, but it was plentiful, and all of it was precious. A new water supply was thus created not only for future pump stations, but also for the Bedouins and their livestock. As one well after another was brought in, concrete troughs were set up. The word spread among the tribes. Soon, thousands of camels, sheep, and goats were brought to drink their fill. The new watering stations were regarded as permanent public utilities. Thanks to tap lines, life became easier for man and beast in a harsh environment. In the tremendous program of transportation and construction, Arabs now outnumbered Americans by as many as 14 to 1. At the peak of activity, more than 14,000 Arabs were at work on the tap line project. Through on-the-job training, they were playing increasingly important roles. Most were employed through Arab subcontractors, who themselves had been set up in business by Aramco or tap line. Men who only a short while ago had never seen modern machinery were operating equipment of all sorts. The majority of these men, including many Bedouins, had been reared in an atmosphere that had changed little in 1,000 years. When they came to work with Americans on the tap line project, every American had to become a teacher. The Arabs proved surprisingly adaptable. Not merely did they learn to do unaccustomed tasks, but they also managed to bridge a wide cultural and linguistic gap. But with all their technological training, their basic thinking remained inviolate, and they continued to abide faithfully by the precepts of the Prophet. As originally planned, the pipeline was to have been pushed simultaneously from both ends. Through government royalties, through education, and through new industrial activities, the Arabs are benefiting enormously from tap lines. At the same time, the Aramco and tap line organizations and their investors stand to be rewarded for their courage and imagination. And finally, the ready supply of oil made available by the Trans-Arabian pipeline system will hasten the reconstruction of Western Europe and strengthen it for peace.